Are you now acknowledging that you lost in 2020?
No, I don't acknowledge that at all.
Let's talk about the state of democracy, the top issue for Americans after the economy and inflation.
Did he lose the 2020 election?
What President Trump has said is that there were problems in 2020.
The fraud and everything else was ridiculous.
What the heck is the Electoral College? Why do we have it? What kind of shenanigans can it produce? What if one elector in Pennsylvania or somewhere else changes their mind? If one elector says, you know what, I'm not voting for Harris after all. Could the Democrats have any tricks up their sleeve? Could they do anything at this point? When, if ever, can a candidate not accept the electoral outcome? There should be one standard by which we measure candidates on both sides of the aisle.
The question was, will you accept the results of the election?
Hello, everyone. I'm Jed Rubenfeld, and welcome back to Straight Down the Middle, Series 2, Election 2024. So, the election's only a day or two away, and if you believe the polls, which you probably should not do, but if you believe the polls, this could be the closest election in U.S. history. And if that's true, the one thing you can be sure of is that there are going to be ferocious legal battles with the outcome potentially decided in courts or maybe even by Congress. Now, if that were to unfold, and you're wondering what the heck is going on, you can tune in right here, because I'm going to explain what's happening with those legal battles, case by case, blow by blow, without partisanship. Today, some basics. I'm going to cover two things. One, first, the Electoral College. What the heck is the Electoral College? Why do we have it? What kind of shenanigans can it produce? That's subject number one. Subject number two, acceptance of electoral outcomes. Candidates are often asked, will you accept the outcome of the election? That's a fair question, but sometimes candidates are criticized for the way they answer it. For example, at the vice presidential debate, Senator J.D. Vance was sharply criticized by some for refusing to acknowledge or concede that President Trump had lost the 2020 election. Supporters of Vance, they tend to come back with the reply, well, other candidates have also questioned and similarly questioned the outcomes of elections or the legitimacy of elections. Hillary Clinton, they say, Stacey Abrams, they say, and somehow those candidates don't seem to come under the same criticism from the folks that are criticizing J.D. Vance. Well, of course, there should not be a double standard. There should be one standard by which we measure candidates on both sides of the aisle. But the question I'm going to try to address is, what should that standard be? When, if ever, is it appropriate for a candidate to question the outcome of an election? Now, in my opinion, the answer to that question is straightforward, but some of you may not like the answer I'm about to give. On the one hand, acceptance of electoral outcomes is absolutely fundamental to a democracy. But on the other, I don't think there was anything wrong with the answer Senator Vance gave at the vice presidential debate. So if you stick around to the end of this episode, I'll be getting to that and I'll walk you through it. But first, the Electoral College. Okay, when you step into a voting booth in America and you vote for the president, let's say Trump or Harris, as you probably know, you are not actually voting for Trump or Harris. You're voting for electors. You're voting for a slate of electors who are expected to vote for the candidate of your choice. In many cases, are pledged to vote for the candidate of your choice. But that means you're not actually voting for the president, you're voting for these electors who in turn cast votes for the presidency. Now, the result of that is that there can be divergences between the popular vote and the electoral vote. So you can get a result where 51% of the population, the electorate, vote for candidate X, let's say Harris, but 51% of the electoral vote goes to the other candidate, let's say Trump. And in that case, if the majority of votes of the electoral votes go to Trump, he's the president. Now, I'm going to walk you through how that works. But first, you might be wondering, how did we get this? Why does the Constitution have electors instead of having the people vote for the president? Well, the answer to that's rooted in history. In the late 18th century, some of the reasons why the framers and ratifiers of the Constitution opted for electors rather than a direct popular vote of the president are not so great. If you look hard, you can find certain effects of slavery in there. Now, I don't have time today to go fully into the history, but let me give you the kind of rough take on why we have electors rather than a direct popular vote for the presidency. Okay, so it's the 1780s, and the U.S. Constitution is the most democratic constitution that's ever been created and ratified for a large country. And the people are going to vote for their local representatives. They're going to vote for their state legislators. They're going to vote for their representatives in Congress. But there's a lot of folks who say the people cannot be expected to vote for president. Okay, that's ridiculous. First of all, they don't know anything about the affairs of the nation. Second, they're not going to know anything about the folks running for president. Remember, there's no mass media at that time. There's no radio, there's no TV, there's certainly no TikTok or X. The folks voting at that time, they're never going to have laid eyes on the candidates for president. They're not going to know what kind of people they are. They're not going to know what their views are. Remember, you don't have the candidates going around the country holding rallies. No, that's considered undignified. You don't have campaigning like that. That doesn't start to happen until much later. So a lot of folks are saying you can't have the people vote for president. That's just crazy. So the framers and ratifiers of the Constitution said, okay, we won't have the people vote directly for president. We're going to have instead the presidency chosen by electors. Now, who are these electors? Well, why didn't they make the electors the members of Congress, the representatives and the senators? You know, in England to this day, the parliament chooses the prime minister. People don't vote for prime minister, the parliament chooses the prime minister. Well, it's very interesting. In America, that's not how our Constitution works. And there was a very clear reason why. They were worried, even back then, about corruption of what we today would call Washington insiders. They didn't want the people in the seat of government already running the federal government to choose the next president because they were worried that they would choose the next president on the basis of deals they would cut. Who's going to increase my pay? Who's going to give me a better position in Washington? They were actually already worried about corruption in what we would call Washington insiders, the folks already occupying positions in the federal government. And so the one thing that the Constitution says about the electors is they cannot be people who already hold office under the United States government. They can't be federal officers. No, instead, the electors will be spread out among the states. They will be chosen by each state, not by the national government itself. That's the origin of how we get electors in each state and state electoral votes. Now, how are these states going to choose the electors? Is it going to be the people in each state voting for the electors? No, the folks who were against that won, and instead what the Constitution says is we'll have the state legislatures decide how to pick the electors. That's right, the people will vote for their state legislatures, presumably in each state under laws adopted by those states. The people will vote for their own state representatives, state senators inside that state, and the Constitution gives to the state legislatures the choice of how to appoint the electors. So, if the state legislature wants to pick the electors themselves, maybe they can do that. Maybe they'll know better. Late 18th century, maybe they'll know better about the affairs of state, and they'll be able to pick people who are more worldly, who can travel up and down the country and meet the candidates and get to know them. So the state legislatures, if they want, they can choose the electors themselves. But they have a lot of discretion. If they want, they could pass a statute saying the governor in our state is going to pick the electors. Or, if they want, they can pass a statute saying, hey, in our state, the people will vote for the electors themselves. And guess what? After many decades and centuries, that's what every single state in the United States has done. It has passed a statute saying in our state, the popular vote will determine who the electors are. The people get to choose the electors. Now, all the same, when you go into that ballot box, you might think you're voting for Trump or Harris. No, you're voting for a slate of electors in that state that is pledged to vote for Trump or Harris. And that can introduce complications. And I'll get to those in a second. But first, you might want to know how many electors, how many votes does each state get? That's kind of important, right? Well, here's what the Constitution says. Each state gets the exact number of electors that corresponds to the number of its representatives and senators in Congress. So if you're Wyoming and you have exactly one representative in the House of Representatives and 2 senators, that's 1 plus 2, you get 3. You get 3 electors, 3 electoral votes. if you're California and you have however many representatives California has, let's say 52, you have 52 representatives plus 2 senators, that's 54 electoral votes. So the number of electors each state has is going to depend sharply on the number of representatives it has, which depends on the population of each state. And each state, in addition, gets 2 electors for its senators. Now, how many total electors are there? Well, that's going to depend, first of all, on how many total state representatives there are. And the answer to that is 435. There's 435 state representatives. If you add them all up all over the country, that's designated by statute. Then you got 100 senators, so that's 535 electors in total coming from the states. So that's a total of 535 electoral votes, right? Wrong, because the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., gets 3 electoral votes, even though it doesn't have any senators, it gets 3. That's 535 plus 3, that's a total of 538. You may have heard that number, 538 total electors. By adding those 3 electoral votes from the District of Columbia, the Constitution has created an even number of electors, 538, the famous number. Now, if you have an even number of electors, obviously that creates the possibility of a tie in the Electoral College. So, to win the presidency, you have to have a majority of the electoral votes. You have to have a majority. In most cases, you're not going to have a tie. Somebody's going to win a majority. There are situations where you could not have a majority. Let's say there's 3 candidates, each of whom gets some electoral votes. If a third-party candidate gets some electoral votes, that could easily prevent any candidate from having a majority. Or, in rare cases, you can get a tie. Now, folks are saying that it's very, very unlikely that we'll have a tie in this election. Most states give all of their electoral votes in a winner-take-all system to the candidate who wins the popular vote inside that state. If you win the popular vote in California, you get all 54 of their electoral votes. And that's how it works in most parts of the country. But there's a couple of states where that's not how it works. Nebraska is one of those states. In Nebraska, each congressional district gets an electoral vote. And, according to the polls, Vice President Harris is expected to get 1 of those electoral votes. And that 1 electoral vote could make all the difference. Under certain plausible scenarios, we could have a situation where Vice President Harris, she takes all the famous blue wall states and gets that 1 little district vote from Nebraska. She ends up with 270 electoral votes. And former President Trump, he ends up with 268. That's a win for Harris. That's a majority, the barest possible majority. But here's what could happen. It's still critical that the electors get to cast their votes. Remember, you go into that ballot box, you are voting for electors, and the electors ultimately have to vote for the president. And they do not have to vote for the person that they were pledged and expected to vote for. They don't have to. In some states, they're forbidden by law from changing their minds, but in some states they're not. Pennsylvania, for example, those electors are permitted to change their votes, even though they were expected to vote, sworn to vote, for the candidate you pulled that lever for inside the ballot box. Now, that can produce very peculiar results. Let's say the election seems to have been decided in just the way I was describing before. With that 1 little district from Nebraska, Harris has won 270 to 268. But the electors have not yet cast their votes. They have to get together in their state and actually cast their votes and then send their votes off to Congress. Well, what if the Trump people lobby the electors, and what if 1 elector in Pennsylvania or somewhere else changes their mind? If 1 elector says, you know what, I'm not voting for Harris after all. I'm voting for Trump. What happens then? Well, then suddenly Harris doesn't have 270 anymore. She has 269. And Trump doesn't have 268 anymore. He has 269. That's a tie. Okay, so what happens if you have a tie in the Electoral College? If you have a tie in the Electoral College, then under the Constitution, the whole election gets thrown to Congress. House of Representatives decides who the president is going to be. That's called a contingent election. Now, Why might the Republicans try to get one elector to change his mind and produce a tie? Because that vote inside the House of Representatives, that's going to favor the Republicans. Let me tell you how it works. The House of Representatives gets to decide who the president is. Now, it's not the outgoing, it's not the old Congress, it's the new Congress. So nobody knows exactly who's going to be in there. Nobody even knows exactly for sure who the majority is going to be. But here's what you've got to know. Under the Constitution, they don't vote representative by representative. It's not like 235 votes are going to go for one candidate, 200 votes going to go for another. No, they vote state by state. There's 50 states. There's going to be 50 votes. And inside each state, by tradition, the vote is determined by a majority of the delegates, the representatives to Congress. Well, right now, the Republicans have a majority in 26 out of the 50 state delegations to the House of Representatives. 26 out of 50, that's a majority. And according to most poll watchers, that's not going to change, even taking into account all the various possible House races that are in play. Folks don't expect that to change. So it's very likely that a contingent election, if the House of Representatives gets to decide the next president of the United States, that's going to favor the Republicans. But wait, could the Democrats have any tricks up their sleeve? Could they do anything at this point? Under our system with the Electoral College sends its votes to Congress. There is a state of affairs where Congress could do something about that. Now this gets very dicey, and you got to hope nothing like this ever happens, but I'm just going to run it through for you so you understand what could happen. The electors send their votes to Congress. Let's say there's a tie. Let's say it's 269 to 269. But the Democrats say, we don't want this to happen. If we let this happen, it's going to be decided by the House of Representatives and the Republicans are going to win. Let's say one state was razor thin in its majority vote. Let's say it was Georgia, let's say it was Nevada. One state had a razor thin majority that voted for Trump. And let's say there was some big legal battle in that state, Nevada or Georgia. And let's say that there are legal battles going on, and some people think that the governor of that state should not have certified the Trump electors as the appointed electors in his state. And let's say that the Democrats want to raise an objection to that. Can they? Yes, they can. Here's how it works. If 20% of the House and 20% of the Senate register an objection to one of the state's slate of objections, and they say, no, we don't think they were properly appointed under law. We don't think they were properly appointed at all. What happens then? If 20% register that objection, well, the House of Representatives goes to its chambers, the Senate goes to its chambers, and then they discuss and they rule on that objection. Now, the objection can be sustained, the objection carries, if a majority in the House and a majority in the Senate votes in favor of the objection. So let's say that the Democrats have taken a majority of the House. So let's say inside the House, they say, yeah, more than 50% vote in favor of that objection. And let's say over in the Senate, let's imagine for a second that the Senate is tied. Senate's tied, and they vote 50 in favor of the objection, 50 against the objection. Do you know who might cast that tie-breaking vote? Well, nobody knows for sure, because these things never happen. But in theory, it could be Vice President Harris herself, acting as president of the Senate. You all know that the vice president sits as president of the Senate and casts tie-breaking votes. Well, that, in theory, could happen here. And she could cast the tie-breaking vote to accept the objection. If they accept that objection, what happens? They come back, they assemble back in Congress. Both houses have accepted the objection. That slate from Nevada or Georgia would be erased, and it decreases the total number of appointed electors. It's not 538 anymore. It's, let's say you take Nevada with its, I think, 6 electors. Now it's 532. Harris would still have 269 votes. Well, guess what? 269 votes is a majority of 532. And she would be declared the winner of the presidential election. Congress would declare her the winner. Now, what could the Republicans do at that point? Do they have any options left? They have one option. They can sue in court. They could try to take an appeal up to the United States Supreme Court. Maybe they could even conceivably sue directly in the United States Supreme Court. What does the Supreme Court do? Nobody knows. We've got no precedent on this. The Supreme Court could say, that's a political question. We're not getting our hands in this. That's up to Congress. They get to decide. That's not for us. I guarantee you that's what the Democrats in this crazy scenario would be arguing. This is a political question, not for the court. But the court might say, no, we are going to decide this. We are going to decide whether those electors from, say, Nevada were properly excluded. And they could decide, you know what? They were not properly excluded. You got to count those votes. You got to count them. And so it is a tie election, and that's got to go to the House of Representatives, and the House has to decide under the contingent election rules, where each state gets a vote, and then that favors the Republicans, but that's how it's got to be, the Supreme Court could say. And what might happen then? It's conceivable that the folks in Congress, the Democrats in Congress, could ignore the Supreme Court of the United States and say, no, we hear what you're saying, but we don't think you have jurisdiction over this. This is for us to decide. Now, the moment that happens in this country, the Supreme Court says X, but the president or the Congress says, well, we heard what you said, but you come and enforce it because we're not listening. Then you got a constitutional crisis on your hands because you got no more law. Now, that's what keeps the United States of America being a democracy. That's what keeps it being a democracy as opposed to being lawless and anarchic. That little paper-thin division keeps us, on the one hand, from being a rule of law country with a democracy, to being a country without law, to being anarchical and subject to autocratic government. That paper-thin division is folks obeying the Supreme Court of the United States. So what you got to have once the Supreme Court rules is everybody's got to fall into line and say, yeah, the Supreme Court has ruled. We will, of course, comply with and obey the Supreme Court's order. If you don't have that, you're left with what John Locke called an appeal to heaven. And by appeal to heaven, what Locke meant was war. It's violence that's going to decide who wins once the law has totally broken down. So you don't want that. And the only way we can stop that is once the courts have ruled, once the Supreme Court has ruled, everybody's got to fall into line no matter which side you're on. And that takes me to my next question about acceptance of electoral outcomes. So, as you know, candidates are often asked, will you accept an electoral outcome, even if it's against you? That's a pivotally important question in any democracy. There's got to be a peaceful transition of power. But what's the right answer to that question? When, if ever, can a candidate not accept the electoral outcome? Well, the first answer is totally simple. The initial vote is decided. Candidates are permitted by law to object to that. They go to court, as specified in the statutes of the various states, whatever state it's in. They go to court and they register their legal objection. If the vote's very close, they're usually entitled to a recount. They might first be entitled to a machine recount. If the vote's super close, in the old days, you'd have a hand recount of papered ballots. But they have legal avenues to register a challenge to the initial vote. They could demand a recount. Those challenges work their way through the courts, hopefully very quickly, and the state Supreme Courts eventually decide, with the United States Supreme Court, again, being the ultimate backstop. You all might remember, if you're not too young, that back in the year 2000, we had a fiercely contested election, Bush versus Gore. It all came down to Florida. Only a few votes separated the two candidates. And there was a whole lot of challenging and legal fights over whether the votes were being counted correctly. And the state Supreme Court said, we don't accept the count that was initially arrived at. We don't accept the count that the state has certified. No, the state Supreme Court ordered a recount. A recount in a number of counties. You got to recount those votes. We've got to be sure we don't accept the current count. That case went to the Supreme Court of the United States, the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court halted that recount, said no, state Supreme Court was wrong. We halt this recount. The vote as determined by the Secretary of State and the state governor, that's the one that counts. That was in favor of Bush. He wins the election. Now at that point, it was critical that the nation accept the Supreme Court's ruling and that Al Gore accept the Supreme Court's ruling. And guess what he did? He said, the Supreme Court has ruled, I accept that. And when the electoral votes were counted in January in 2001, guess who was presiding over that count? It was the vice president. That was Al Gore. When those votes came in from Florida, Al Gore counted those votes. He said, here are the votes from Florida. He didn't try to do anything tricky. And more respect to him for that. All respect to him for that. That was the right thing to do. But up until that moment when the United States Supreme Court had ruled, of course it was appropriate for him to bring his challenges and to say, I'm not sure whether I actually lost this election. So lesson number one is, candidates, of course, are permitted to challenge and question an electoral outcome so long as they have legal avenues of challenge available to them. Once those legal avenues are exhausted, once the Supreme Court rules, they gotta fall in line. Critically important in a democracy, if they don't, all hell breaks loose. So Gore did the right thing, and any candidate in this election, whichever way the election comes out, when the legal authorities have given their final answer, that candidate, even if the result comes out against him, must accept that outcome. At that point, you shut the heck up, you extend your hand, you say, Mr. President or Ms. President, I accept that you're president. Good luck to you. God bless America. That's the end of it. But if you are asked, if that candidate is asked, at that point, he's extended his hand, I recognize you as president. If you ask him the next day, did you actually win the election? What do you really think? He's allowed to answer, I'm not sure I really lost the election. Let me go back to Bush versus Gore to give you the example. Did you know this? For 12 months after that election, the New York Times, along with 5 or 6 other major news organizations in the United States, they said, you know what, we'd like Florida, we'd like you to give us all the votes. Remember, these are paper ballots. Give us all the paper ballots. Would you do that? We'd like to go over and count them ourselves. We'll hire neutral people. We'd like to count all of them again and see who really won the election, in the sense of who really got the most votes. Florida said, yes, we'll do it. Here are the ballots. Now, it cost a fortune. I think in the millions of dollars to do this, but they did. It took them 12 months. During that time, the New York Times and other major news outlets said, we're going to see who really won the election. Now, when they said who really won the election, they meant who actually got the most votes, who actually got the greatest number of validly cast votes. That's what they meant. If you ask them, well, but do you recognize that Bush is the elected president of the United States? Of course, they would have said yes. Of course, we recognize that he's the president. We recognize that he's the authoritatively declared president of the United States. He is the president. He's the commander-in-chief. We all recognize that. We will all comply with his orders. Every newspaper should have said that. Every candidate, every member of government should have said that. And yet they were entitled to ask who really got the most votes. And this brings me back to what Senator Vance said at that vice presidential debate. Because it was kind of a gotcha game. What they asked him was, who won? Do you concede that President Trump lost the election? See, that's a tricky question. If you mean by lost or won, if you're asking, well, who actually got the most votes? In the 2020 election, there are a lot of people who think that if you could really recount all the votes, you'd find out that Trump won the election. Now, if that's their opinion, in our country, you're entitled to that opinion. It could be right or wrong, but you're entitled to the opinion. Because guess what? We were never able to get all those votes together. First of all, there aren't paper ballots. Well, it's machine stuff, and you often can't get inside the machines. And in any event, there are way too many states in play. Millions and millions of votes. Impossible. No neutral party could ever get all those votes or get inside all the machines and recount for sure. If you're one of those people who think that Trump may actually have won the 2020 election, just in the sense of who got the most votes, if you could go back and recount all the votes, you're entitled to that opinion. And if you're J.D. Vance and you're asked that tricky question, if it's his opinion that he's not sure who actually got the most votes, he's entitled to that opinion. If they'd asked him, but do you accept that Joe Biden is the authoritatively declared winner of the election and is the president of the United States and is the commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces with all the authority and power that that entails? If they ask him that question, the answer to that's got to be yes. Of course, I accept that the authoritatively declared winner, after all legal avenues have been exhausted, is the president, is the commander-in-chief and has all those powers? You've got to say yes to that question. There's got to be a peaceful transition of power. But if you're asking, well, who got the most votes? You're entitled to say, if it's your opinion, you know what, I'm not actually sure who got the most votes. You're entitled to say that. Now, you're also entitled to say, and I also don't think the election was fair. I think the Hunter Biden laptop story got suppressed, or I think this, or I think that. You're entitled to think an election's not fair. Hillary Clinton apparently thought that with respect to supposed Russian collusion in the 2016 election. You're entitled to have that opinion. You're entitled to express that opinion. Of course, that doesn't change an outcome. Let's say somebody lies to 10 voters in some state and says the polling booths, the polling places are open to 11 p.m. And so, a bunch of people go to the polls at 11 p.m. Guess what? It's closed. And it was a lie. It was against the law to lie to people, tell them the polling booths are open to 11 when you know for sure they're not. That's actually against the law. It's unfair. Those 10 voters, let's say, who show up at the polls at 11, it's unfair that they didn't get to vote. But it doesn't matter if it's unfair. You still don't get to count their votes. They didn't show up to the polling place on time. They don't get to vote. The vote is the vote. So you're allowed to say, if you think it's true, an election outcome was unfair. You're allowed to say, if you think it's true, I don't know for sure who got the most votes. But what you must say, if asked, is yes, of course. Once the legal avenues have been exhausted, once the Supreme Court rules, that's the end of the matter. That person that is authoritatively declared to be the president, is the commander-in-chief, and I will respect that. I will recognize his authority, and I will respect the peaceful transition of power. That's what you got to expect from our candidates. And with that, I'm finished. Let's all wish ourselves good luck in the upcoming election. Let's hope that some of the scenarios that I've set forth for you never happen. Let's hope that this election isn't decided in the courts. But if it is, stay tuned, because I'll be walking you through all the election battles, step by step, straight down the middle. Goodbye.